Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present Chayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and passions run high in the Jewish community, especially over issues that seem to impact Jewish survival, the security of Israel, the future of American Jewry, the safety of Jews around the world who are increasingly confronting overt anti-Semitism. Jews can be very passionate and can see truth and reality in very different ways. Why is there no peace between Israel and the Palestinians? Who is fundamentally responsible? Who's at fault for the ongoing conflict? Is the occupation necessary, or is it an insidious choice being made by an Israeli government? Which leader is more committed to peace, is more humane and caring, Benjamin Netanyahu or Mahmoud Abbas? And is President Obama a friend of Israel or an enemy? Has the president been good for Israel or bad for Israel? And while all of us know few things in life are ever black and white, that life is a rainbow of gray, very often in the Jewish community, the arguments are drawn in very stark terms. But gray or stark, committed Jews, committed, involved, caring Jews, very often see things differently. And to some extent, we'll see to what extent, but to some extent, that description of committed, caring Jews, seeing things differently, applies to my two guests who are joining us on this edition of Chayim. We begin with Thane Rosenbaum, a professor at NYU's Law School, where he's the director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society, an award-winning novelist and writer. Thane's most recent book of nonfiction is entitled Payback, The Case for Revenge, which discusses how the criminal justice system is predicated in part on the human need for retribution. Thane is also a frequent guest moderator at programs presented by the 92nd Street Y. You've seen him on Shalom TV. And he often writes opinion pieces on aspects of Jewish life. And his most recent article, which appeared in the left-wing Israeli newspaper Haaretz, was entitled "The World's Cruel Indifference to Israel's Plight," in which Thane reflects upon what he sees as a lack of any real concern for the plight of 3 Israeli teenagers kidnapped by Palestinians on the West Bank. And here's a part of what Thane Rosenbaum wrote in his piece. As the search continues for 3 teenagers who were kidnapped while hitchhiking to their settlement in the West Bank, Israel's historical dilemma regarding terrorism is starting to come with a hitch. The sympathy of the Western world, once lavished on the Jewish state, has lessened to the point of near indifference. Most nations are silent, many human rights groups are uncaring, and Jewish institutions have shown themselves to be ineffectual. Now, in response to Thane's opinion piece in Haaretz, another major voice on the world Jewish scene, Peter Beinart, authored his own piece in Haaretz, criticizing specific arguments in Thane's piece and countering the overall perspective of Thane Rosenbaum's article with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the nature of Israeli occupation. Peter Beinart, the former editor of The New Republic, and he's now with The Atlantic. He's an editor of his own blog, Open Zion. He's also an associate professor of journalism and political science at City University of New York. He is also the author of books himself, his most well-known being The Crisis of Zionism. And in his response to Thane Rosenbaum's op-ed piece, here's a bit of what Peter Beinart wrote. The kidnapping of Naftali Frenkel, Gilad Sha'ar, and Eyal Yifrach is a terrible crime. And given our history, I understand why some Jews worry that when our children suffer, the world shrugs. But the difference between this era of Jewish history and past ones is that today, Jews are capable not only of suffering pain, but of inflicting it, which means that we too have a responsibility not to shrug. 3 Palestinian teenagers died last week. Hundreds more languish in administrative detention, where they can be held indefinitely without trial. Yes, some of them may have thrown rocks, which is wrong. Some may have done worse things than that. But I suspect that if our children grew up without the basic rights that their neighbors took for granted, some of them would throw rocks too. 2 very different views of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I am so pleased that Thane Rosenbaum and Peter Beinart have both agreed to sit together to continue this discussion in person here on Shalom TV. And incidentally, the audience should know, and again, you two come at it from very different perspectives. I've had the good fortune to get to know both of you. You are both lovely people, and I find that one of the things that is often misunderstood in the Jewish world is that really, while there may be some that you can say, oh, he doesn't care about Israel, he doesn't care about Jewish life, he's not a real committed Jew. You both are passionate, committed, involved Jews, and you see things differently. And I give you enormous credit, both of you, for willing to be sitting with me at this table. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Thane, once again.
Thank you, Mark.
So what were you trying to do with our?
So I was pointing out something that for people who were raised in the 1960s and the 1970s may have seen this in a very different way culturally, which was there was a time in world history when one looked much more sympathetically about the condition of Israel's situation in the Middle East with respect to its neighbors and specifically with respect to terrorism. We remembered Munich and embassy bombings and cruise ship hijackings and airline hijackings, and it did seem that the world's response in connection with the abduction of these 3 teenagers was much more muted, and there was far less sympathy. And even the kidnappings in Boko Haram generated a response from our president and our first lady, but didn't seem to merit a response here. And that there's just seemingly less sympathy. And I said, look, surely there will be people who will say that, the world has become inured to the conditions of terrorism in that part of the world. And then, of course, there's a different perception of Israelis, of who they are today in that region as opposed to who they were. In those days, they were the plucky, spunky fighters from the kibbutzim. And today they're seen as a superpower. And of course, it's only with Peter Beinart that I can show up on the Mark Golub show and end up on the right, because Mark will tell you this is a weird position for me. I'm on the left always on this show. And only Peter can make me go to the right. But yes, there is without question. One would have to say that the occupation and the settlements have eroded a great deal worldwide, a great deal of the sympathy that existed for a country that was just being hammered by its neighbors and was in no position of being an occupying power.
Do you have any disagreement with anything he said so far?
Well, I think I think Thane is exaggerating a little bit the level of indifference. I mean, after all, Barack Obama himself did make a statement, I think it was yesterday, saying our hearts are with the kidnapped boys. I mean, I don't think the President of the United States has ever made a statement about the death of a Palestinian child, for instance. So I think the fact that it grows to the level of the President of the United States has been a front-page story in the United States. It was a statement by the Council of Europe. So I think the level of indifference was exaggerated a little bit. I do think that it is true, and something that worries me a great deal, that I think Israel, that there's less sympathy for Israel around the world than there was. And I think there are a variety of reasons for that, larger kind of macro trends in the world. But I think the point that Thane made at the end is a very important one, which is that before 1967, every person who lived in the state of Israel was a citizen of the state of Israel. They had the right to vote for its government. They lived under the same legal system. Now, it's true, Arab Israelis were under military law, but basically you had a political system which was fundamentally democratic. That still exists inside the Green Line. But on the other side of the Green Line, you have a system that's fundamentally undemocratic. And in a world that has become, I would say, in which the language of democracy has become more and more the legitimizing force for any government. I think Israel, in its policies in the West Bank, has been running smack into that. Now, that's not to say I don't think that Israel gets disproportionate criticism. I think it does, and we can talk about the reasons it gets disproportionate criticism. But I think an important part of the story is Thane recognizes also the change that has happened in Israel since 1967.
Okay, and I want to talk to both of you about how you see the change. But I want to just follow this up one more moment. You wrote the piece before Barack Obama mentioned his sympathy for the, and by the way, I don't think Barack Obama has ever talked about the death of an Israeli soldier. So that for me, the parallel is not, gee, he said something about the kidnapped Israelis, but he's never said anything about a dead Palestinian. He doesn't normally talk about dead people. What the horror of this story is not that somebody died, and it's horrible when people die. What's here is it looks like there was, the kidnapping of 3 kids on the West Bank. It does evoke what happened in Nigeria. And there were more girls kidnapped than these 3 Israelis. But it was all over. It was all over. It was on the network nightly news. It was on Fox every night. It was on MSN. It was everywhere. But I have not seen a word said on Fox about the kidnapped Israeli soldiers. It has almost got no ink at all, and it's almost, I don't know that all 3 networks have even referred to it. So that when I read your piece, it resonated with me. And then I said to myself, something about this piece, forget about what Obama said there, prompted you to write your response to it. And the way it came to me is, Peter Beinart wrote a response to Thane. I said, this is how interesting. Where did you take issue? So I do want to get to the other issues of how do you two view, it's wonderful having the two of you here to talk about a lot of things in the Jewish world. But I want to talk about how you view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, West Bank, Palestinians, Abbas, Netanyahu. But I still don't understand. What about his piece prompted you to write?
What prompted me was the fact that Thane wrote a piece saying that the world needed to be more empathetic towards this terrible suffering that's going on in Israel because of this crime committed against these 3 teenagers, which I entirely agree with. I think the more attention that they can get, the better. But it was a piece that I thought had a very, very dismissive view towards Palestinian suffering. And indeed, almost all the references to Palestinians are simply equating them with terrorism. And I wrote about it not because I have anything against Thane, who I think is a lovely guy, but because I do think that this represents for me what is a larger problem, which is we have a particular concern about the fact that the world doesn't feel our suffering. And given our history, I understand where that comes from. But I don't think that we always live up to our own to what we ask of others in terms of our willing to recognize the suffering of Palestinians. There's been a tremendous amount of suffering of Palestinians. Palestinians have done lots of bad things, but that doesn't negate the fact that if we want empathy for Israeli Jews, we also have a responsibility to have empathy for Palestinians. And I didn't see that in this column.
But I wasn't making any special pleading for empathy or sympathy. I was just pointing out a reality that what was once a world that rooted for the Israelis now seems to be indifferent to their plight with terrorism. I wasn't making any special pleading.
Well, actually, Peter quotes passages from your piece that he feels are dismissive of Palestinians and of Palestinian feelings.
Terrorists. Dismissive of terrorists.
He says it's terrorists.
Yeah,
not
when I'm talking about the Palestinian, I'm talking about an era in which all of those kidnappings, hijackings, cruise ship, these were conducted by the PLO. That was our memory of the 1960s. I'm talking about, and here's where the twisted argument comes. And it was just, I think, just read earlier, Marshall, who is one of the leaders for Hamas. I'm not sure if he's I'm sure exact is his official word. It's in Haaretz right now. I just saw that he refers to the 3 kidnapped teenagers as soldiers. And that's the kind of twisted moral relativism that I feel like when I listen to Peter, I'm thinking, what country is he talking about? Because I'm certainly not someone who doesn't have a sense of sympathy for the Palestinian experience. Mark Golub brings me on this table to be that guy. It's just, again, today I'm not that guy. But I'm talking about something else. This is not about a special pleading, and this is not about as he pointed out, a contempt for Palestinian suffering, I would say, Peter's got a contempt for history, a contempt for reality. There's a historical context in which this comes from, and the reality is that there's nation building in Israel and there's rocket launching in Gaza. These are not moral equivalents. It's not a moral equivalence. I mean, Marshall is referring to 3 abducted teenagers as if they're soldiers. They're not soldiers. They're just teenagers. And I think that this is where the difference is, that we are asking Jews and Israelis, and I think many Jews, and certainly me, I've always believed that there are legitimate grievances on the Palestinian side. I've been on this show many times saying, please don't put me in a position to defend the settlements, because I can't and I won't. Right, and I think that we know that Jews, especially Jews and Israelis, go into a tremendous amount of moral anguish and conflict about what Jews have to do to uproot terrorism. But let's not call the purposeful abduction of 3 teenagers the same as, which is what Peter was referring to, the teenagers that were killed in these military defensive operations. Let's not put them in the same category with 3 teenagers who are throwing either Molotov cocktails or homemade hand grenades or rocks during a period of house-to-house searches for kidnapped kids.
Well, look, I was not referring to Thane Rosenbaum in general. I was referring to this particular column, right? My point was not in any way to defend Palestinian terrorists. It's that when you only equate Palestinians with terrorists, you dehumanize them. And when you say, as Thane does, you kind of remark longingly for the days when people said, and this is your quote, what kind of people were those so-called Palestinians, they all wondered. I don't look back to that day. That wasn't my quote.
That was the quote of people who said that, right? Because but remember, the context in those days, this wasn't an occupied area. This was just disputed territory. I mean, we had a very different understanding.
But that's a dehumanizing language to say, what are those kind of people, so-called Palestinians? Imagine if people talk that way about Jews. I don't look back fondly on the days when people first of all, questioned whether Palestinians were actually a people, and second of all, asked whether they were human beings like us. They are human beings like us. They're human beings like us who have, since 1967, lacked, in the West Bank, the basic rights that we all take for granted. Some of them have responded to that situation very, very badly in ways that have been immoral, horrendous, and self-defeating. And I have friends myself who have suffered from that terrorism. But when you want to talk about the context, the context is also the fact that when Israel goes and takes people, including teenagers, from their homes in the middle of the night in Israel, those people lack due process. Those people are not citizens of the state that controls their lives. They don't have the right to vote for its government. They live under a military court system with a prosecution rate which is above 99%. So that is also an important part of the context here in understanding Palestinian suffering. Yes, Palestinians have done things that I would never, ever defend, but I also find indefensible a situation where for almost half a century you hold people simply because of they're of the wrong religion and ethnicity without the basic rights that their Jewish neighbors enjoy.
But you are defending them. I mean, in essence, you are. What you're really saying is, look, what Thane says doesn't apply to all Palestinians, and Thane would be the first person to say, of course it doesn't apply to all. But there has to be some accountability that when democracy was brought, when there was a withdrawal from Gaza, the people voted for Hamas. When you talk about 50 years, you make it seem as if the occupation is totally baseless, that there's no historical context for this, as if, what in the world are the Israelis doing by occupying these peaceful people? A number of occasions have taken place over decades in which Palestinians were offered the opportunity to make their own nation, and it does seem as if they walk away repeatedly from those negotiations because it doesn't appear as if nation building is important to them as either rocket launching or the Nakba, things in which it appears as if what they're really embracing is a Jew-free Palestine. And let's not least walk away from the levels of indoctrination. We haven't yet talked about, 3 kids were kidnapped. And then immediately online, you're seeing, this image of little children in Palestine, in the West Bank and Gaza, pointing out 3, right? Or throwing candies. You so willingly excuse it.
No. I'm not excusing
you are.
I'm not excusing that at all. I said, I think,
show me where the Israelis do that, where children celebrate, throw candy.
Do you know who David Raziel is?
Boy, that's a long,
Come
long
on.
time
No,
ago.
this is a
Peter.
man. Wait a second.
That's a long time
Peter.
ago.
This is a moshav named after him in Israel. There's a street named after
It's
him
a
in
long
Jerusalem.
time
No,
ago.
I'm
It's
talking
a
about the street is named after him now.
Extremely
There's-
small
there's-
numbers of
Wait a second,
Israelis
wait a
have
second,
ever
wait-
felt this way.
Wait a second.
Tiny.
Have you looked at Thane? You're a really good guy, but one of the reasons I think you keep saying appear and seem is I'm not really sure you know this material very well. Okay, look, if you look at the polling, and I can cite you poll after poll, you ask Israelis what percentage Israeli Jews, what percentage of them believe that Israeli Arabs should be able to run for the Knesset? What percentage of Israeli Jews would live next to an Arab? You get between a third and 50% of Israeli Jews. In 2010, Tel Aviv University asked what percentage of Israeli Jewish high school students believe that Arab Israelis should be allowed to vote. 56% said no. Amongst Israeli religious, it was to 82% said no. So if you're talking about
prejudice,
you're talking about incitement.
You're equating prejudice with murder.
That's hatred.
No, it's not. The United States, even today in the Deep South, even today in the Deep South.
When Ovadia Yosef called Palestinians vermin and ants, that was not hatred. This is one of the most powerful rabbis in the state of Israel. I'm not excusing anything on the Palestinian side. I believe that Palestinian incitement should be dealt with severely. There should be an anti-incitement commission that looks at the textbooks and the media on both sides, and if there are things that incite violence and hatred, they should be dealt with severely. But I think that because we want to believe the best about our side, and because, frankly, most Jews in this conversation have not spent a lot of time with Palestinians in the West Bank, so they don't actually really understand. They might understand intellectually, but they don't understand what it actually means on the ground to live for your entire life without basic rights. Let me just one small story, because we're talking about one of these kids tragically is American, right? On June 6th, so this is before the manhunt for these three kids. There were two elderly Palestinians who live in the United States. They've lived in the U.S. for 45 years. They go back in the summer to a town called Silwad, because that's their ancestral village. Israeli troops came in at 3 a.m. in the morning and held them, put them in a room, took their cell phone and held them incommunicado in that room for 13 hours. That is not that uncommon.
What was the reason?
The reason was they thought there was a terrorist threat there, presumably. They didn't arrest anybody, but the point is, to understand this context, you can't only understand the fact that there is terrorism, which there is tragically, you also have to understand the fact that people live without basic rights. In the United States, if someone came in because there was a terrorist in my neighborhood and held me for 13 hours, I would have some recourse. I could get a lawyer. I would have rights. These people do not have basic rights. And that is, you can't understand this conflict and this problem without understanding that.
Well, that's exactly why Americans passed congressional leaders passed the Patriot Act, because they recognize in order to combat terrorism, you can't evaluate basic rights in the same way. I mean, that's the whole point of Guantanamo Bay. But what I'm not willing to do, which you're so very casually willing to do, is equate basic prejudice, which are cultural differences, even in the United States. Some black people don't like black people. Some people don't like Asian people. Yeah, if you poll, you're saying, Thane, you're not familiar with the polling. Yes, I'm sure that if you go poll around the United States, you'd find, I'd rather not live next to so-and-so. I'd rather not live next to so-and-so. I'm simply not willing to do what you do, is you equate that to murderous annihilation. You say, well, the Jews really don't really love the Arabs. So if the Arabs really want to kill Jews, that's got to be okay.
I'm talking about incitement. I'm talking about incitement to hatred and incitement to violence. And the difference between America and Israel is, although goodness knows we have a lot of problems, is we don't have a part of the United States under American control where only people of one religion and ethnicity have citizenship and the right to vote and the right to due process. Israel, tragically, since 1967 does. And it's, it's worth noting.
But why?
Why?
Why? Because they just made, it's as if that historical context means nothing to you.
No.
It's like we woke up and said, we really want to just have our own country.
I think you need to distinguish two different things. If you want to argue, and I think people don't do this stuff, if you want to argue to me that Israel has to maintain military control of the West Bank because it would be dangerous to Israeli security to give up that control, I would disagree with you, but it's a plausible argument. I understand where the argument comes from. But Israel has also done something completely different, which is that it has massively subsidized Israelis to move into the West Bank,
with you there.
Civilians with government money who live under a different legal system than Palestinians. There is no conceivable security rationale for that whatsoever. In fact, it's very bad for Israeli security to have all of these civilian settlements in the middle of the West Bank on purely military grounds. You cannot blame the Palestinians for that. And it is that massive...
I'm sorry, for what? You can't blame
You can't blame the Palestinians for the huge settlement subsidies that have led to the fact that, for instance, in 2013, housing growth inside the Green Line was 5%, and in the West Bank, among settlements, it was 130%. You can't blame the Palestinians for the fact that settlers receive 70% more government money per person, according to Yediot Ahronot, than Jews inside the Green Line. Israel has to own that. That has been a tragic and terrible mistake that I think is putting the entire Zionist enterprise in peril. Also has a terrible, terrible effect on the lives of Palestinians, because the Israeli government itself acknowledges that a third of those settlements, this is the Israeli government's numbers, are built on privately owned Palestinian land. This is not like it was the Palestinians in general. It was an individual Palestinian. And that is a very important part of this story. It wasn't part at all of the column that Thane wrote.
Because that was very different, right? The column that I wrote was that here we have 3 kidnapped children, 2 boys, and there doesn't seem to be the same level of sensitivity or sympathy to that. That was really pretty much what I was talking about. What you wanted me to also say is, well, Israelis are not, or rather American Jews are not showing the appropriate amount of sympathy for the sense of mutual grievances. And the question is, mutual grievances is one thing. It's just to equate, which is exactly what Abbas does, to say, look, 3 kids that are throwing Molotov cocktails are in the same position of 3 kids hitchhiking home. And I'm not willing to call self-defense the same as premeditated murder. I'm not willing to treat anti-Semitism and call it human rights, because this is something that I'm not willing to do. I want to be more clear-eyed, look at the facts on the ground and say, I'm looking at, look, I do not see Israeli children throwing candy in celebration of Arab deaths. And I do see that in the West Bank, and I'm seeing that now. Israelis are not indoctrinating their kids about the Nakba and hating the other to the point of, we want to eliminate all Jews, all Israelis from this part of the world.
Well, I think that when you have polling in Israel, which shows that 50% of Israeli Jews and higher numbers of young Israeli Jews don't want to live next to Arabs, that does say something about the education and the media that they are part of.
I live in Harlem. People would have very similar polling to that. So what? That doesn't give anyone the right to commit acts of terror.
Of course it doesn't.
But you are excusing it.
I have never in my life... In what way have I ever excused terrorism? I've said again and again and again, I think it's immoral and self-defeating. What you, it seems to me, are not taking ownership over, which I wish you did, is that this is occurring in a context in which people lack basic rights. So even when you say they threw Molotov cocktails, there is no due process in the West Bank for us to figure out what they did in a way that would be considered just. In the military courts in the West Bank...
Where does that happen anywhere in the world? Where would it happen anywhere in the world where a liberation movement, which was essentially armed against another people, that we apply the same basic civil rights and same civil procedure as we do in a courtroom on domestic land?
There's also a lot of violence, unfortunately, comes out of settlements as well, and price tag attacks. But when those settlers, but the difference is when those settlers attack people, as they do all too frequently, unfortunately, they go before civil courts where they are able to see the evidence and present it. They can testify. They cannot be held in administrative detention indefinitely.
I wish that weren't true.
Right. So this.
I'm sorry. What do you wish weren't true?
I wish that weren't true. I wish that we were. I wish what Peter is actually saying. Look, I'll say this again. I've said this on this show many times. I'm not going to be an apologist for the settlements, and I'm not going to be an apologist for disparate treatment for settlers that commit crimes against Palestinians, blatant acts of their own type of violence.
Are you suggesting to the Shalom TV audience that if settlers perpetrate crimes on Palestinians on the West Bank, they're not punished?
No, I'm saying essentially what...
No, just answer.
I'm saying they're subject to a different level of jurisdiction.
They live under a different legal system.
Are they punished?
I assume they're punished, but I assume they're not punished in the way that Peter was describing, house arrest, in which people are put away indefinitely.
Yes, but you spent a long time explaining the different context of these two communities. There's an enormous contextual difference. And what's amazing to me, it's very, very disappointing to me, very troubling. The one thing that, for a long time, the one thing we did not have was the kind of settler violence that has slowly begun to rear its head. And we could say, they were right-wing, they took certain positions on the land, but they weren't doing violent acts, and they weren't doing violent acts against the Israeli army either. And slowly that's changed. At the same time, institutionally, it is not permitted. It is not condoned. These people are punished. They live, Peter is right that they live in a totally different system. But there are reasons that they live in this totally different system that you have articulated very well. So that
what's the reason?
For which they live in a very different system.
What's the moral justification for having one legal system for Jews and one for Palestinians?
At the moment, you have a people here who, for whatever reason, do not want to live with us in peace. That's number one. And number two, the kind of violence that is reflected, whether it's kidnapping 3 innocent kids on a road on the West Bank, or whether it's thinking it's totally appropriate to take a Jew who's an American, put a bullet in his head and his chest, and throw him overboard a cruise ship. Those things are not. It's appropriate to break into some home in Itamar and slit the throat of a 3-month-old baby while that baby is sleeping. These are atrocities that have created a separation between a community that is very troubling to a Jewish world which overwhelmingly was willing to live with them in peace, and a very small group of sort of what I consider is our extremists, to whom the entire Jewish world is abhorred by them as well. At the same time, they are living under, you're correct, a different system wherever they are. Israel is going to treat them differently. But what is interesting to me is, as opposed to the South that you referred to before, for a long time, when a Southerner did something to a black, the Southern system didn't go after that white supremacist. In Israel, even if it's a settler, right wing, with strong ties to whatever parties, he's going to be punished. He's not punished like the Palestinians. Nothing in Israel is like the Palestinians. And the question then is, why is that true? And I do want to hear you speak to that issue. I mean,
Why was what true?
Why is it that we have now a setup on the West Bank where there is 2 totally different systems of living? Just a minute. Right. And it comes from you talk to average Jews in America, all we want to do is live with them in peace, and we've given them the opportunity. Every time we give them the opportunity, they sort of make sure the opportunity is not seized, and that it's not because Israel wants to be on the West Bank. And it seems to me that the position you're taking is that Israel is doing this because it's motivated to have a greater Israel, and it wants the West Bank.
I don't think one can talk in a unified way about Israel, right? There are lots of people in Israel who would be very happy to leave the West Bank. The Israeli political system has been taken over since 1967 by, and our political system is also taken over by powerful interest groups at various points, by a very powerful lobby that usually controls the ministries that involved with money allocation to the West Bank, that is deeply invested in making permanent Israeli control of the West Bank. It's hard for me to understand. Part of it is for deep theological reasons, because people believe that this is biblically precious land, which it is, by the way, which is part of the reason I have no problem whatsoever for Jews who want to live on the West Bank. They just have to live equally as equal citizens to their Palestinian neighbors. Would never deny someone the right to live in Hebron if that's important to them. But those people have pushed very hard. There have been Israeli governments that have been themselves strong, like Menachem Begin's government, strongly identified with that.
Yes.
And there has been an idea that controlling the West Bank and making impossible the creation of a Palestinian state would be good for Israeli security. I think it's actually a disaster for Israeli security because it makes peace impossible. You can't simply talk about the fact that we want to live in peace in the abstract. You have to talk about what are the terms under which there has to be justice for there to be peace. Palestinians have to have a country in which they can have their own basic rights.
Finish the thought, and then I'll let Thane answer. Yeah. In your vision, what would be the ideal if you could control Israeli politics, or reform Israeli politics, not control? What's your ideal vision for how whatever happens on the West Bank goes forward in what you would consider to be a just, a Jewishly appropriate way?
So the first thing I would do is I would stop paying people to move into the West Bank, and I would start doing the reverse. I would start. A lot of the people in the West Bank, most people, settlers in the West Bank, are not there for theological reasons. They're there because the Israeli government made it a lot cheaper for them to live there than inside the Green Line. I would reverse that.
Part of what you want is you want Jews off the West Bank.
I want Jews I want Jews who are willing to move back inside the Green Line to be willing to live to be subsidized by their government to live in democratic Israel, not non-democratic Israel.
But ultimately, we're going to make everything democratic in your vision. And I found it fascinating that you argue, and I've heard you do this before, that you believe Jews ought to have the right to live on the West Bank as long as they're willing to live under Palestinian sovereignty, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. At the moment, my understanding is
You're wrong. With all due respect, I know what you're going to say. It's not true.
Well, let me say it. Let me say it.
Okay.
Say it.
Okay, because I hear these things so often. I'm sorry.
Okay, let me say it, and then you can explain why I'm wrong. My understanding is that the Palestinian position is certainly initially, and maybe long term, the West Bank is not Hebron and Nablus and none of that. Karnei Shomron, even if it were willing to live under a Palestinian flag, which settlers in Karnei Shomron have told me to my face, separately. They didn't even know what the other one said. Every single person I spoke to at Karnei Shomron said to me, although it wouldn't be my preference, if I could stay here under Palestinian sovereignty in a two-state solution, I would stay. Okay. But my understanding, they say to me, is I'm not being given that right.
Right. This is Mahmoud Abbas from 2012. I don't oppose any Jew who wants to live with me. The Palestinian position, as made very clear in a number of statements, is twofold. That Jews can live in the West Bank under two conditions. First of all, equal law. And as part of that, you cannot have an ethnically exclusive community. You have to understand how the West Bank works today.
I'm talking about Palestinian sovereignty. They'll live in a Palestinian state.
Right. Right. The Palestinians have been pretty clear that if Jews are willing to live under equal law, they can live in a Palestinian state. But they can't live in ethnically exclusive communities. It means that if a Palestinian wants to move into Kiryat Arba or into Ariel next to a settler, they have the right to do that.
And the Jew has the right to move into Hebron next to an Arab place.
Absolutely.
Okay. And your understanding is?
I think it's very important.
That Mahmoud Abbas is totally fine with that.
Mahmoud Abbas has said repeatedly, so have his ministers. Yes.
You say he's fine with that.
Yes.
Is that what you understand?
I really don't know. I really don't. I would love to see a world in which there is a two-state solution, and in fact, Arabs and Jews are living side by side in the West Bank. Boy, that would be an incredible sight. Of course, we don't actually see Jews moving back to Libya and Morocco and Algeria and Egypt. The experience in that area is that if once you're gone, you're gone. You're not invited back. I would love to think that what Peter's telling us about Abbas is correct, but I don't know. Is that true or is it a pipe dream? If you look at the experience in northern Africa and in the Middle East, you don't see Jews being welcomed back into Arab countries. And if Palestine will become a Palestinian Arab country, I just don't see it. But look, what I would say is that, I'm troubled by Peter. He's now done this several times. He's reciting polling throughout Israel about, there are these still feelings, not warm feelings between Israelis and Arabs. Of course there aren't. They've had years of conflict. Wars have been fought over the same land that they claim they possess. There's been killings, murders, and deaths on alternate sides. Yeah, they're going to have reciprocal grievances and reciprocal hard feelings towards each other. But that's very different from saying, yes, and so therefore what? And when I hear Peter, I think he deplores terrorism, but he deplores it in a casual way because he moves past it very quickly and saying, look, Peter, the reality on the ground is it does not appear as if there is nation building in the hearts of most Palestinians. It does not appear as if the world of the Nakba is not something that is not totally indoctrinated and ingrained. One of the reasons why Palestinians purportedly walk away from all deals is because the deals they still end up being a two-state solution, and there's no right of return, and it does seem to be unsolvable in that way. Okay, but I'm just saying, my essay was very clear. All I was saying was, here was another example of a broken peace process, right, that culminates. You have a unified government between Hamas and Fatah, and then 2 weeks later, kidnappings. You withdraw from Gaza, Gilad Shalit, kidnappings. You withdraw from Gaza, 10,000 rockets are fired. I'm not seeing what you're seeing. You see, and I see you see it very clearly. And by the way, part of your charm, and it's part of what's great about you, and many people who are Jewish with you. You see a moral purity and perfection among Jews that are being utterly failed
Absolutely
in
not.
this. You look upon us, you hold no accountability, you ask everything of Jews and Israelis, and you ask nothing of Palestinians.
Honestly, I ask nothing. I ask Palestinians to accept a partition of the land of Israel in which they get 22% and Israel gets 78%, and which the Palestinians have to give up their dream of having their parents or grandparents who were born in Haifa or Jaffa. 70% of Gaza is made up of people, of refugees. I'm asking them to give up that dream. I'm also asking them to take a demilitarized state, which I'm not asking for Israel. I'm telling them to accept all the Jewish neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. I'm asking them to accept an international force in the Jordan Valley on their territory. I'm not asking the Palestinians to accept anything. That's crazy.
Why aren't they accepting this?
In fact, this Palestinian government, Mahmoud Abbas's government, is within the Clinton parameters that were offered in December 2000. Abbas has an offer for a 1.9% land swap. Israel can keep all the Jewish neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. Let's make it clear. It's not a return to the 67 lines. All of the Jewish neighborhoods built in East Jerusalem, except for Har Homa, which they have a particular problem with, because it was built in the 1990s under the last Netanyahu government, all of them are acceptable. Israel can have a land swap where it gets to keep probably 60% of the settlers. Palestinians are willing to accept severe limitations on their sovereignty while not asking the same on Israel. Mahmoud Abbas has accepted all of this. Ask Ehud Olmert, ask Shimon Peres. You have an Israeli government that has rejected the idea of a Palestinian state with 67 lines plus swaps. This is an Israeli government that is fundamentally hostile to the kind of Palestinian state that was discussed in the negotiations between Ehud Olmert and Mahmoud Abbas, and that Bill Clinton laid out in December 2000. That's the reality today.
Look, we don't have Secretary of State Kerry here, right? And I can't purport to know what was going on in these negotiations that apparently failed. And so I don't know. You're saying that the entire reason is because Netanyahu is hostile to any kind of bilateral.
Well, Netanyahu said it very publicly. Remember, in 2011, Barack Obama said the parameters should be 67 lines plus swaps, which had been the parameters that had defined all prior serious peace negotiations. Netanyahu flew on a plane to Washington, D.C., you remember, and said, absolutely not, I do not accept that parameter. I have a lot of criticism of things that Yasser Arafat did in the past, but at this moment, between Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu, the side that is missing the opportunity is the government of the State of Israel, because it's dominated by people who oppose the two-state solution, period.
I want you to be right. But I do. I want you to be right.
I wish I were wrong.
I'm rooting for your version of why there was yet another breakdown. I want you to be right. I'm sitting here saying, I don't know. I
only will say this as I listen to the two of you. If I'm Abbas and I am what you say I am, there's nothing I wouldn't do to make it happen. And that means I wouldn't I'm the president of the Palestinian Authority, and I am really committed to what you're saying I'm committed to. I would say the following: Mr. Netanyahu, Prime Minister, whatever you call him, I'll meet you anytime, any place. Let's just talk. Let's talk. And none of that. You, Prime Minister, don't have to make any preconception.
Okay.
None of that. Yes, you've done settlements. I wish you hadn't, but that's in the past. I want to move forward. The benefits for me and my people are so overwhelming that nothing would prevent me from talking to you. And the way it has been presented to us, and Peter, I don't believe we get the truth all the time from the news, from the media. So
nor do I.
Okay, so all I know is this: the way it's been presented to us is that every time there's an opportunity, and Netanyahu, you quoted him correctly, by the way, not incorrectly. He is very unhappy with what I always understood was the beginning point, the armistice line with some kind of adjustments. Right. For me, I don't know where they're going to trade land, but there would be adjustments. And none of that seems to me an Israeli Prime Minister has a right to go into negotiations and say the neck of Israel is too small. He has a right to say that. And we have to figure out a way that it's not 9 miles from the border of the Palestinian state to the Mediterranean Sea. He has a right to say anything, but once he gets to the table. But if I'm Abbas, I go to the table,
Right,
and I don't say, I'm not coming because you built a second floor with a toilet.
Here's the thing. Abbas went to negotiate for 2 years with Ehud Olmert with no preconditions. The Palestinian view
It doesn't matter.
No, it does matter. There's a reason that Abbas doesn't want to go to negotiate with Netanyahu with no preconditions, because Netanyahu has not entered the ballpark of serious negotiations. So he very legitimately worried that he's going to be in negotiations with this Israeli. Remember, this Israeli government has also done more settlement expansion than any of its predecessors. It's doubled funding for settlement. So if you're a Palestinian, you look at the situation, you say, we're negotiating over a set of territory at the very time that territory is being taken away from us. And that is a situation that if you're worried about a prime minister who you think wants to negotiate with you for years but never get an agreement because he's not accepted the basic parameters of agreement, is very problematic for a Palestinian prime minister. If Netanyahu said, I accept 67 plus swaps, I think that you could have negotiations tomorrow.
It shouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter to me. I'm talking about me.
But
it could be because the benefit for me of getting him in the room. And by the way, if I show up, and Netanyahu doesn't show up, then nobody disagrees with you.
No, but Netanyahu will show up. What Netanyahu wants is permanent negotiations that never lead to a deal, because permanent negotiations get the world off his back.
And you know this how?
I know this because he has not accepted the only parameters that could potentially lead to a deal. There will be no deal which is not based around the idea of 67 line plus swaps. That's what Bill Clinton said. That's what Barack Obama said. That's what Ehud Barak recognized. That's what Ehud Olmert recognized. This is an Israeli government that is dominated by people who are overtly hostile to the two-state solution.
I want to read this paragraph you wrote, and then both of you respond to it. This is from Peter Beinart's article in Haaretz. The irony is that Bibi considers himself a master of diplomacy. He's on Meet the Press more than John McCain. I'm not sure that's true.
All right.
He's forever coming up with catchy phrases designed to resonate with Americans. Yet, he's losing the propaganda war to Abbas, who speaks English like a Bulgarian diplomat from the 1980s. The reason? Abbas is capable of conveying some basic decency when it comes to the other side. Bibi is not. Are you saying that you think Mahmoud Abbas has a greater sense of decency than Benjamin Netanyahu?
I think when it comes to the way that Mahmoud Abbas talks about Jews and the way that Benjamin Netanyahu talks about Palestinians, look at what Abbas has said. Abbas said recently, and there was a history of controversy about this issue, as Thane knows, he made a very strong statement about the Holocaust being the worst crime in human history. He made a statement about these boys in Saudi Arabia, these teenagers. He didn't call them settlers. He didn't call them soldiers. He said they are human beings like us and they should be back with their families. He said it in Saudi Arabia. This is also a man who, by the way, who's a refugee himself, who was born in Sfat, who said that he does not expect, those were dangerous things for him to say. You find me the statements that Benjamin Netanyahu has said about Palestinian suffering that have been anywhere near that regard. Abbas was pleading for him. I talked about this, pleading for him in the fact that 6 Palestinians have now died since the operation to go get them. Now, I'm not saying that you can do this in an entirely peaceful way. I understand that it's a very difficult process when you go into Palestinian areas. But not all those 6 Palestinians did not all need to die. Not all of them were terrorists. One of them was a 78-year-old woman who suffered a heart attack when Israeli soldiers went into her home. Now, could Benjamin Netanyahu not say that she was also a human being and that I deeply regret that this 78-year-old died? Could he not make some kind of gesture? Nothing has happened like that. And if you read his writing, as I have read a great deal of Benjamin Netanyahu's writing, you see in his big book, A Durable Peace, he puts the word Palestinian suffering and plight in quotation marks.
Any comment?
Look, the Israelis have never been great at selling themselves. So there's no doubt that what Peter is saying is correct. Abbas comes across as avuncular and more caring, and Peter's quite right. I wrote for Haaretz. I think people were surprised that I wrote, Abbas's comments about the Holocaust were very significant. And I think the Haaretz titled it, "We should take him at his word." For now, I thought it was very significant. And yes, and we don't have the same levels of empathy that have come out of Netanyahu. I mean, I guess that's probably true. But again, there is a context. It would be great if Netanyahu were to say, an innocent 78-year-old woman had a heart attack on this day, and this is a horrible consequence of the situation
Okay.
but what I'm not prepared to do, and I don't know if this is what Peter's ultimately saying, I'm not willing to draw a moral equivalence for what actually happens within the West Bank, or certainly in Gaza, when Gaza was the people of Gaza democratically elected Hamas. And I've written for the Daily Beast and others that this disproportionate loss that you see when Israel attempts to uproot terrorism, you can't look at it as a measure for measure scale, because you have to understand that that attempted murder, 10,000 rockets, is something that no country would tolerate.
My understanding is, and we get this from Memory. Memory is an organization that monitors everything being done in the Arab world, in the Arab language, and very often Memory claims that what Abbas says in English is not the same thing he says in Arabic, and it's not just Abbas, it's many members of the Palestinian Authority and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I have quotes in my office where Abbas is saying there will be no Israeli living on the West Bank. Not only that, if there is any kind of occupation of soldiers on the West Bank, no Jew can be a part of any kind of UN group that's on the West Bank. Now, I don't know when he said it compared to when you've got here, but I didn't bring it into the room, so I can't quote it. The other thing I feel is the following. There is something unrealistic, idealistic but unrealistic to me, I'm afraid what both of you are saying here. The state of Israel is going through an incredible tragedy right now. Their heart is being torn apart. I spoke with Izzy Liebler from Jerusalem, and Izzy said, this doesn't even compare to the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, that this has gripped the people of Israel in a way that he has never seen before, that they're just beside themselves. And what they're trying to do is put pressure on Palestinians to give them information. And as a result, the mental fixation here isn't about, I want to be sweet to a woman who died. I am sure if you talk to any Israeli, including Netanyahu, he would say and mean it on some level. It's too bad. But, and I hear the but from the state of Israel, but look, at the moment, that's not my concern. My concern is that I am dealing with a people, I'm not two guys in a car. I'm dealing with a people that is facilitating kidnapping 3 teenage students off the street. And for days, no Palestinian was killed because the Palestinians weren't resisting. They sort of went, well, this is what it's going to be. And then slowly the resistance began. Only then, when resistance to the IDF doing its best to find these kids, finding information, who knows what, and they know so much about these people, that, it turned out that when kids threw rocks or threw cocktails or threw whatever, some of them got killed. I am sure no Israeli is happy about that.
Look,
but it doesn't bother me. It doesn't offend me that Mahmoud Abbas, who for days said nothing, and many people believe he was forced to say whatever he said in Saudi Arabia, for days said nothing, while Hamas is taking him apart for he's even allowing the Palestinian police to help the Israelis. Okay, so at the moment, if I'm Netanyahu, I'm sorry, a 78-year woman got killed, but excuse me, that's not where my attention is now,
look,
and I appreciate that.
Look, my attention is on those 3 teenagers too, okay, right? My kid's school sent out Tehillim, right? Psalms that we should read for them. I've been reading them too, okay? I'm also a member of the Jewish people. That's also where my primary focus is too. But I think we have to understand that that there is another people here called Palestinians who understandably are also going to be attuned to their own suffering,
Absolutely
which did not begin when these 3 boys were kidnapped, right? The gatekeepers, so the gatekeepers, which was in interviews with 6 former heads of Shin Bet, right? Carmi Gilon, who's former head of Shin Bet, said, "This is not me, this is Carmi Gilon, who ran the Shin Bet. We are making the lives of millions unbearable, and it kills me." That was long before the most recent operation to get those boys back. This has been a permanent reality of Palestinian life for 47 years.
And it's because we're doing it because, in your mind, we want to.
Some people are doing it because they believe that it's necessary for security, but no one can legitimately argue that the subsidizing of settlers to live under a different legal system in the West Bank is in any way related to Israeli security. It's not. It's related to an ideological project that is very dangerous to Israel's future.
Okay, we don't have time. It would be, first of all, the two of you are fabulous. And you don't normally get to hear this level of discussion. I am so proud of you, and quite honestly, I'm proud of Shalom TV that it has now enabled two people of your stature to come and fight this out. And you have to know, I'm sitting with two lovely people, and even though I disagree at times, these are extraordinary human beings, extraordinary Jews. One of the things, every now and then, Peter, somebody tries to slap you as, oh, he's not. You're a tremendously committed Jew, and I understand what you're saying. I think we see it still differently, and I still want to do at it more. I don't see the occupation coming out of what you see it coming. I see the West Bank, by the way, as disputed territory, and it's not clear to me that Jews don't have the right to be subsidizing Israelis to move on to the West Bank to live if at the same time, there's a Palestinian people who are not willing to live with me in peace. Okay. And if Abbas is everything you say he is, I don't believe he is, but I'm willing to say, I think as you've said also, I hope you're right, and maybe I'm wrong. I'd like to get you here with other people who know more than I do. But let's supposing you're right. I do certainly believe that inside the Palestinian world as a whole, inside the West Bank community as a whole, there are still strains, at least strains, of Palestinians who are not interested in making peace or living in peace. And that's a problem for the state of Israel.
There is no question that there are plenty of Palestinians who can never accept Israel's existence within any borders. There's no question about that. All Palestinians feel that Israel was created as a racist, colonialist project whose legitimacy they fundamentally reject. That's all Palestinians.
All Palestinians.
I know a lot of Palestinians. I've never met a Palestinian who thinks that Israel's creation in 1948 was legitimate. That's a unanimity. There is a division among Palestinians between people who, on pragmatic grounds, can make what is for them the tragic concession that Israel is going that there's nothing you can do, and Israel is going to be here now as an existing fact, and that you should be willing to accept Israel's right to exist as long as your children have the right to live in a government of their own. That's one group. And the second group are willing to fight for however long it takes in order to destroy the state of Israel.
And as long as the second group exists, what do you do?
But this is the critical point. Israel has a vote. This is why it's so important. Israel has a vote in that internal Palestinian divide. Every time Israel subsidizes more Israeli Jews to move into the West Bank and make the possibility of a Palestinian state more and more impossible for Palestinians to imagine, we make Hezbollah and Hamas stronger. We have had a Palestinian leadership with Salam Fayyad and Mahmoud Abbas that has been in the former group. Abbas himself, a refugee, has been willing to say, I don't expect to go back, again and again saying we accept Israel's right to exist within the 1967 lines, beyond the 1967 lines. When you make those people look like fools in the eyes of their own people, because they can't stop the settlement growth that is destroying the possibility of a Palestinian state, you play right into Hamas's hands. That's what frightens me.
Just finish the thought, because it's very effective what you're saying. Just finish the last thought. And if it were true, every single thing you're saying is true, but you've still got the other half that say under no circumstances am I going to live side by side with the state of Israel. Then what?
You defeat them politically by showing Palestinians that there can be a state, and you weaken them politically because the divide is shifting. It's not a permanent. It's not permanent. There are a lot of Palestinians who might be willing to accept the idea of two-state solution, but they don't believe Israel would ever offer it to them. If you empower Palestinian leaders who are committed to nonviolence and who are committed to the two-state solution, you weaken those Palestinian militants who are up against it. And that, people may find this hard to believe, but I've had several Palestinian friends of mine say to me with a straight face, why does Israel support Hamas? And I say, Israel does not support Hamas. That's a crazy statement. And they say, where we sit, All of Israel's actions have actually been to strengthen Hamas and to weaken Abbas and Fayyad. Fayyad was your favorite politician ever. You should see what he said to Roger Cohen when he left office. He said that Israel destroyed him politically because his nonviolent pro-two-state project was destroyed politically among Palestinians because he couldn't stop settlement growth.
Might come as a surprise to some of your viewers. I agreed with a lot of what Peter just said. I have said before at this table that I thought Abbas was about the best partner we were going to get, and that he should have been strengthened, and he should not have been undermined in the way that we've undermined him. That doesn't mean that he hasn't said things in Arabic that might have contradicted some of the things that he said in English. I don't know. I can't speak to that. I know this is what's been said. But I do know that he does seem as if he's been our best possible partner for peace. Okay, but let me just say, as I said before, I was troubled when Peter was reciting polling in Israel, because he's just unofficially telling me more polling, which is if you ask most Palestinians how they feel about the Israelis, they don't love them. So the idea that there's a mutual grievances or mutual reciprocal hostility is hardly surprising after decades of this kind of animus.
Yes, by the way, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy came out with a poll just this week as we're taping,
Right.
where 55% of the Palestinians on the West Bank, 68% of the Palestinians in Gaza say that the ultimate goal of the Palestinian people should be to reclaim all of historic Palestine,
Right,
from the river to the sea.
First of all, even the Washington Institute recognizes that poll was a departure from previous polls. And secondly, with all due respect to the Washington Institute, I have a lot of friends there, which was created as an offshoot of AIPAC. If you want to look at the best Palestinian polling, which is done by Khalil Shikaki, working in conjunction with the Hebrew University, you find that according to Shikaki's polling, which I think is more authoritative than the Washington Institute, which has a little bit of an agenda, you still find that more Palestinians say they support the two-state solution than the one-state solution.
Do you have an agenda?
Yes, absolutely have an agenda.
Okay, everybody has an agenda.
No, I know, but I'm saying when you look at polling, you always ask the question of whether this pollster has a dog in the fight. And in the case of the Washington Institute, again, even though I have friends there and they do good work, if you were in a political campaign, you would not take their polling as authoritative because they're essentially on one side.
I'm just saying that you don't like this poll because you don't like what the poll shows. You've got a poll on your side that you like better.
I don't trust it in the same way I wouldn't trust a PLO poll.
Okay, it seems to me though that you want to endorse what Peter's saying.
Part of it, but here's what I would say. Given everything that Peter and I would actually agree with, and let me just say, let me agree with more. I wish there were no settlers. I wish there was a moratorium on building and construction. I wish there wasn't even an issue about is it Zone A or is it Zone B. I wish that none of that was going on because I think that it ultimately undermines any chance of strengthening Fatah's hand. But let's just say that given all of that truth, even this kidnapping, we're not willing to draw another conclusion, which is, yes, Abbas has said the right thing, and yes, the Palestinian police security people have been involved in assisting the IDF. But if there is a new unification government between Hamas and Fatah, and Abbas is not able to pick up the phone and say, you got those kids? Because you're really screwing me up. Get those kids back here immediately. If he's not able to do that, what really is the strength of that partnership? I mean, if I'm Netanyahu, and let me say, I don't want to speak for him, but this only continues to strengthen his hands. He's saying, look, you listen to a guy like Peter Beinart, very well-intentioned and well-meaning, but he doesn't live here, and I'm telling you, I've got to actually negotiate a deal with these people, and I can't. First of all, Hamas has not renounced or denounced its former past as of wanting to rid all Israelis in that area. But in addition to that, they kidnapped, and Abbas ends up being impotent in the face of that.
Look, I agree that how to deal with Hamas is a very difficult question. I believe that Israel has not only the right, but the obligation to defend itself and its own citizens. I'm not a pacifist. I don't oppose Israel responding militarily to anything that Hamas does, or for that matter, Islamic Jihad does, or Fatah does. Because let's remember, in the Second Intifada, Fatah was also responsible for they got right into the game along with Hamas and Islamic Jihad. On the other hand, you have to, if you want a legitimate Palestinian interlocutor, you have to have an interlocutor that has some legitimacy amongst its people. You have not had elections among the Palestinians now for close to a decade because of this fear that Hamas may win. right? Now, it seems to me, first of all, if you want to try to minimize the chances of Hamas winning, there are things you can do that I think we agree with. You can strengthen Mahmoud Abbas, right? You could also let Marwan Barghouti out of jail, who's far more popular than the leadership of Hamas, and has said very explicitly that he supports the two-state solution. So if you really want to weaken Hamas, there are things that you can do. But ultimately, if you want a strong Palestinian leadership, you're going to have to allow the Palestinians to elect people who we might find reprehensible, people who oppose. Now, if those people act violently, you should arrest them, you should retaliate, but they should be allowed to have
What do you mean arrest
election.
them?
My point is that if you believe people are taking violent actions toward the State of Israel, you have the right to respond to those people. But you should allow people who do not support the two-state solution to run in Palestinian elections, just as we allow people who do not support the two-state solution to run in Israeli elections and actually hold important ministries in this Israeli government.
I'm among those who grew up with a very liberal view of what it meant to be not only a Jew, but also a Jew who supports Israel. I have said forever on Shalom TV, my position is that the Jews from the 1930s, late 30s on, ever since the Peel Commission, have made a formal declaration that they would share the land. They have said there are two peoples here. The only way that is fair and workable is for us to share the land. It was said in 38, it was said in 47, it was said in 48. And from my perspective, and here we just differ, I believe that there have been Israeli governments which have said the exact same thing. They said it in 67 before Khartoum, and they've said it since. And I have said repeatedly to people who come in with a different view, I think that ultimately the right Jewish thing to do is to share the land. But I will only share it with people who really are willing to live on the other side of that border, wherever the border is, really in peace with me. And it's a peace that will be enduring. It won't be a peace for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years. I have to have a sense that the Arab world is stable and that whatever peace is created, it will endure, because ultimately we have one Jewish state, and if it ever goes down, that's the end of the Jewish people. So for me, what I have painfully sort of been dragged and kicking into seeing, and I am with now a growing majority of Israelis, is that although I am intellectually in favor of a two-state solution, I am not convinced that there is a people, a power structure capable. I can't say whether what they really do or do not want, but they're not capable of delivering a united Palestinian community that really is willing to take care of that 50% you talked about, who do not want to live in peace. And I thought you were remarkably honest, and I hope our audience heard it. This is Peter Beinart talking here. What Peter Beinart said was he has never been a Palestinian who doesn't believe in his heart there's something unjust about the creation of Israel. On a different show, I'd love to hear you talk about how you deal with that. What does that mean to you, and are they ever persuasive to you? But there are Palestinians who, even though Peter says are committed to the notion that there shouldn't be that the Jewish state is unjust, they're ready to live with the Jewish state in Israel, Jewish state side by side in peace. But I've got the other 50% you talk about, and that 50% seems to always foul it up. I want to say a stronger word, but this is television. They always foul it up, and in the end, the state of Israel, which in my mind, whether Netanyahu is the perfect Jew or not, still has been representing a people who were willing to live in peace after Oslo, and then after 2007, and it's not their fault, the Israelis' fault, that they have not found a partner for peace. And my own movement is that while I continue to remain ideologically committed to sharing the land, it becomes less and less of a practical solution. And then I am in a quandary, because if I don't see that as a realistic answer, what answer do I see? And that's where I am. Feel free to make a final comment.
What I would say, look, there's a lot that you said that I disagree with, but I think that we should be able to have a common consensus about this. If we all believe that the two-state solution is the only ultimate solution that gives justice and dignity to the Palestinians and allows a democratic Jewish state to endure for our children and grandchildren, which is what we all want, then we have to keep the idea of a possibility of a Palestinian state alive for the future. You may not think it's possible now. You may not think the Palestinians are ready. That's what you've said. But for goodness sake, don't foreclose the possibility of a Palestinian state ever, which is what these settlement subsidies are doing. Once the settler population reaches 1 million, then it will not be possible to continue to talk about the idea of a Palestinian state. This Palestinian state has to be viable. It has to be contiguous. People have to be able to live there. They have to be able to grow. So even if you don't think a Palestinian state is possible tomorrow, I think you should be screaming for the rooftops to say, keep alive the possibility of a Palestinian state one day, and don't foreclose it by continuing to make more and more permanent facts on the ground in Israel that make a Palestinian state impossible, and push Palestinians into the arms of that second group who say, we will fight for 1,000 years until there is one state, which is an Arab state.
I think it's so much easier to be an American in this kind of a conversation. It's so much more fun and interesting and speculative, actually. Peter's, I'm a law professor. I also teach human rights. Peter says, look, I can't believe that the Palestinians are living under a different legal system in the West Bank. And I'm thinking, well, that's exactly what we do when we prosecute terrorism in the United States. We don't have very good success in applying civilian trials to people who have been accused of terrorism. To root out terrorism, it's very difficult to do it under the conventional strict adherence to constitutional standards. It shouldn't be surprising to us that that's the situation that the Palestinians have found them in. And secondly, it's easy to be an American because Canada's our neighbor. The Canadians are our neighbor. Mexico's our neighbor. I wonder what the United States, I wonder what Peter would say if the neighbors were Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, even with 2 countries there in which we have a workable, sustainable peace treaty, and a new country in which the kids are still indoctrinated into the thinking of the catastrophe and not really given a sense that, in order for this to work, there actually has to be 2 states for 2 people living side by side.
I have enormous regard for you, and whether we agree or not, enormous regard. You're one of my favorite people on this planet. I think both of you come here and articulate what is very important for American Jewry, and really Americans, and many non-Jews watch Shalom TV, to think about. If we could, we would go on for another hour. I'm just hoping, I know how busy you are, and it's not easy to come out to the studio, but I hope at some point you'll let me continue with you. You're just,
Thank you.
Yasha Koach. Yasha Koach.
Peter.
Thank you.
Just beautifully done. Thank you both. Marvelous. Thane Rosenbaum, author of Payback, The Case for Revenge. Peter Beinart, author of The Crisis of Zionism. I hope you enjoyed hearing their exchange of ideas. Again, you don't normally get to hear this kind of dialogue in the Jewish community, so I'm very proud and I'm very grateful to both of them that they came. Of course, what about your ideas? What's your reaction to the thoughts of Peter Beinart and Thane Rosenbaum? Where do you agree with either of them? Where do you disagree with either of them? Please share your thoughts with me. This week, I'd love to read some of what you have to say on Shalom TV. Email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall. And I'm a big tweeter now. Tweet me at Rabbi Mark S. Golub. I look forward to hearing from you. My thanks for this edition of L'Chaim to producer Carol Lilienthal, Serge Goldberg, Sloan Copeland, thank you. Camera people, thank you for making this edition of L'Chaim possible. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. L'Chaim, my friends, to life.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support Shalom TV with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the Shalom TV website homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive on DVD with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.